Okay, cool. So hi everyone, welcome to week 5 of Figma Decal lecture. This week we're going to be focused on prototyping and accessibility. I already introed myself to everyone in the room, but for everyone watching on the recording, my name is Cecilia, and I'm so excited to be teaching. Okay, so yes, we're going to be talking about these two main things today, but before we do that, we're actually going to intro the midterm project to you, which I personally love doing when I was in this class. So yeah, but if you first want to take a second to scan this QR code or go to the link to fill out the attendance form, feel free to do that. Cool. Anyone still need the link? Okay, sweet. And if you want to pull up the slide deck link to follow along, I think it might be helpful, especially because with prototyping, a lot of things are good to like take a look at yourself, and we'll be doing a demo today. So if you'd like that as well, feel free to pull up this link. And just to note, some of the dates on it might be different. This is an older version of the slides that we have for like viewing purposes, but yeah, most of it's content-wise, you're getting the same thing. Cool. Okay. Now let's talk about the midterm. Our ask here is that you create a design-related project about a local restaurant. So we want you from 0 to 100 to follow one of the prompts we've created about a local restaurant. And we've come up with four different prompts, and you also will have an option to propose your own. So let me talk a little bit about why we decided this and get into the prompts. So why local restaurants? Three main pillars of why we wanted you to do a project on this. The first is personal familiarity. So with a local restaurant, obviously this is different from like a big chain or franchise restaurant. You will be more familiar with it. You might know the people, you might know, you might be familiar with the space. It might be a place that you've grown up with a core memory of. So you'll be able to perform fantastic user research using both your experiences and those of your friends and family, or maybe even the people that run the restaurant. You'll have that personal connection to draw from, and that's so important when you're designing. Tangibility is another one. So much of design is digital, conceptual, very like hypothetical, up in the air, but the local restaurant is a place that you've actually been to, and you can much more easily visualize, the kinds of solutions or the kinds of problems you're designing solutions for. So you don't always get the opportunity with design, and that's pretty cool. And the last is community. So because restaurants are a physical space and you've been there and people go there and you congregate with people there, they inherently are a space where community is created. So you'll be able to factor in the kind of community that's involved in this restaurant as you're designing. Cool. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the prompts. We know that a lot of people take Figma Decal because you're interested in like either visual design or UI UX. So we sort of created 4 prompts that branch off of those two main disciplines. So for visual design, you have 2 different prompts options that you can choose from. The first is branding, and essentially you will be looking at the existing branding system of the restaurant and recreating a new one. And then going off of that newly created branding system, you'll be designing your own marketing illustration, like a menu or a poster, some flyer of some sort. And then you'll use the pen tool and vector networks to implement that illustration. You'll also want to use the pen tool and vector networks for the illustration prompt if you choose that. And essentially, you'll just be choosing you'll be creating 3 illustrations for the restaurant. So yeah, the visual design prompts involve the pen tool and vector network as like Figma tools that you want to focus on. For the UI UX side of things, you have two options, and the UI UX prompts really focus on the usage of components and variants in Figma. So you have two options. The first is recreating the restaurant's existing website. Note existing. If you want to create a website for a restaurant that doesn't have one, just message your TA about that. But as we know, most restaurants do have their own websites, but they often haven't built it or designed it with like the infrastructure, like the eye that a designer might. And it might be hard to navigate or hard to use, hard to order, etc. So you'll look at its existing website and then show your progression of low, mid, and high fidelity wireframes and create 3 to 4 screens. Again, using components and variants. And sort of a similar thing for mobile. But unlike websites, a lot of restaurants, while they have their own websites, don't have their own mobile apps. So you'll be designing a delivery app specific for the restaurant instead of like a generic deliveries like app like Postmates or DoorDash, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll be showing the same thing, your progression of low, mid, and high-fi wireframes using components and variants. So those are the 4 prompts that we've defined. But you also have the option to submit your own project proposal. So if you have something else in mind, or none of the prompts really speak to you, you can still focusing on a local restaurant that you've been to, submit a proposal by this Friday. Like outlining what you want to make your project about, and also specifying whether you'd use pen tool or components as like the Figma tool you want to focus on. So yeah, you have a lot of room to like be flexible with that. Just make sure to get those proposals in if you want to do your own. And in the meantime, feel free to ask your TA if you like need any guidance deciding what prompt to focus on. So yeah, the midterm submission consists of 2 things. One is a Figma file that contains both your final project submission as well as your entire process. So for example, not just like hi-fi wireframes, but low and mid-fi as well, or the different iterations of how you rebuilt a branding system. So everything, but it should be pretty clear what is the final submission. And then you'll need that link to the Figma file in your short write-up, which is essentially just a 300-word brief on why you chose this restaurant, your user research, what challenges you ran into, and what you ended up submitting as your final design. Okay, you'll have 2 weeks to work on the midterm, so it'll be due on the night of lecture 7, but it'll be available for up to 70% credit until that Friday. But as part of this class, we do have a slip day policy, so either for the midterm or the final, you can submit a project up to 24 hours late without penalty, and we'll just factor that into the project that it best applies to. If you need any other sort of extension for personal reasons, or you have DSP accommodations, please just let us know and email us, and we'll be sure to make that happen. So yeah, the project specs are here if you wanted to pull them up, but again, we'll be pushing like all this info after class too. But yeah, that's essentially the midterm. I think it's a very like exciting project to have agency over and to have a personal connection to. So I hope you're excited to work on it because I think it's a lot of fun. Any questions? Okay, sweet. Then let us talk about design accessibility. What is accessibility? Sorry, let me just hide these. Okay, perfect. What is accessibility? So the concept of accessibility seeks to sort of create a world where different products, experiences, etc., can be accessed and used by everyone, regardless of what sort of abilities they might have. And how does this apply to design? In design, yeah, essentially you want to consider what capabilities people have in lots of different environments and consider what disabilities people might have. So disabilities are often standardly defined in two ways. One as a physical or mental impairment that might limit your ability to perform certain activities, or two as an inability of the environment to accommodate for an individual's needs at that moment. And you can sort of think of it as people having certain abilities, or people in a certain environment having certain abilities, but their environment not accommodating for them, or their environment restricting them from doing something that they're being asked to do. So in some, as you can see from the chart, in some like in some situations, something might be considered an impairment or a disability, and in other situations, it might not. For example, if you go somewhere where you don't speak the standard language, it would be sort of an impairment to be in that country without any sort of linguistic help. So yeah, you might think of a disability as a mismatched persona, or a mismatch between a person and their environment, where the environment doesn't adequately support whatever abilities they have. But yeah, for those of you who know that I am a linguistics major, I think that language is very important. Language is always changing in the way that we use to, the terms that we use to describe disabilities and accessibility is always changing too. And here is a pretty classic example of that. So traditionally, hearing impaired is a term that was used to describe people who might who now identify as deaf or hard of hearing. And I think over time, the term hearing impaired has taken on a negative connotation because it focuses on the impairment and ties the person to that as part of their identity. And you know, there are all sorts of conversations people might have about like reclaiming different aspects of their identity, but I think that a lot more people now prefer deaf or hard of hearing. And that's just one example of a lot of the language that's shifted over time. So just keep in mind that when it comes to accessibility, especially, what's acceptable or preferred by like certain members of a community is always changing, and it's important to be mindful of that. And let's talk about a couple pillars of design accessibility. So there are three sort of principles of design accessibility outlined here that talk about a different aspect of making design more accessible. The first one is usable design. So does your product or experience function as intended? Is it easy to use, basically? Accessible design, surprise, surprise, is design that will make accommodations for people who need it. It offers accommodations so that an experience can be accessed. An inclusive design is design that includes as many people as possible. So pretty straightforward. And even though these all sort of get towards the same end goal, you might see how they're a little different definitionally. And we'll talk about how that might apply to or how they might be joined together. But first, here are a couple examples of accessibility in visual design. The first one you might have heard of are image descriptions, or sometimes called alt text. So often you have like a graphic or a photo. There's one of Ace here. And you'll see that it has an image description. Photo of Ace surrounded by turquoise and yellow decorative shapes, he him pronouns. So it just includes like a verbal description of something, of an image that's pretty concise but still descriptive. And that's used if someone might not, if someone has like a visual impairment, or yeah, otherwise needs text to be like read or verbal or written out to get a better sense of what an image contains. Color contrast is also a good example of accessibility in visual design. Essentially, it exists, there are certain standards for color contrast that exist because individuals who might have some like color blindness or like color vision impairments might not be able to distinguish like text from background if the contrast isn't high enough. And a third example is captioning. So closed captioning just transcribes audio into text. So people that are deaf or hard of hearing might use the captioning so that they can read alongside something that's otherwise visual or that's otherwise audio based. Cool. Okay, so to dive a bit more into color contrast and why it's important in design, I mentioned that people who have some form of color vision deficiencies might struggle if color contrast isn't high enough. So let's look at this map of the BART network. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you know, we define BART lines by their colors. But for someone perhaps who's looking at this network with like who has like a color color vision disability, they might not be able to see those like they might not be able to distinguish those colors, so they might not be able to access the train routes as easily. And if we look here, like if we are saying something is called the yellow line, someone who has protanopia might see multiple yellow/yellow adjacent lines. And someone who has tritanopia might not see any yellow lines at all. So maybe there are other ways that BART can make their lines more accessible, you know, on their maps. Maybe they could include different patterns for lines or some other way to mark like the naming system for the different train lines. Some other examples of accessible and inclusive design uh, also relate to transportation. So tactile paving lets us know where it's like approaching a platform edge at train stations through both color and texture. So most people can tell when it's like dangerous for them to be stepping somewhere on a platform. Curb cuts, which actually started in Berkeley, allow for people who might be in wheelchairs to go on and off the sidewalks. And again, you see that like paving that's textured so that they know when it is. There's also text to speech and speech to text translations. So it'll, yeah, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, but different types of translations so that you can vocalize your thoughts into writing and vice versa. So we want our designs to be usable, accessible, and inclusive. So fully functional, include all groups, making appropriate accommodations. We essentially want to be at the center of all of this. And that is what we call universal design. So universal design takes all of these into account and is sort of a composite of all of these things. And so that is our like main goal for design. We want it to offer all of these things without having to do extra to be accessible to someone. A good example of this are these vegetable peelers. I don't know if the brand is OXO or OXO, but yeah, they essentially made these really grippy vegetable peelers that everyone can use, with the idea being that people who need grip support or might have arthritis would struggle with like a standard vegetable peeler, which are really hard to hold and require quite a lot of force. So they created these grippy ones. And I remember actually, I do have a friend who like has arthritis and ended up using these instead because she was telling me how she like couldn't really like her hands would shake a lot when she tried to use like the standard vegetable peeler, but with these that were more accommodating, everyone can peel vegetables with ease, and they offer the support that some people who need grip support need. So they are fully functional, which makes them usable. They're inclusive of like all types of people, and they're accessible. You don't need any sort of like embellishment or attachment to use these. So that's essentially a short overview of design accessibility. I know that was like a lot of like talking about stuff and concepts, but I think that like a lot of the Figma Decal course staff would agree that design accessibility is so essential. In my personal opinion, I don't think like design should exist without accessibility because design exists to make the world better for people. And if you're not really like taking into account how you can improve an experience for someone or make the world more navigable for them, then it doesn't really like make sense why you're making something. So that's my little spiel, but does anyone have any questions or thoughts on accessibility that we've covered so far? Okay, sweet. Let's move on then to basic prototyping. So let's talk about what prototyping is and what is it used for. But before I dive into that, does anyone have a sense of what they think prototyping is or why, in what cases we might use it? Yeah, in the back. What's your name? Hi. Yeah, that's a great description. Yeah, I like that, Emily. Yeah, basically like you want to see how something actually like works in action. Um, so I really like that. Yeah, so prototyping is the process of turning concepts into tangible forms, which is like basically what you said. So in a general sense, like not necessarily within Figma, it can be like, oh, I want to see like how my app works if like these users actually interact with it, or it can be like, oh, I want to see how this like machine works once I build like a basic working like version of it. So yeah, or I want to see how my ergonomic standing desk works once I like construct it out of wood and things like that. So yeah, that's essentially what prototyping is. And yeah, it can be digital or physical, but in the context of Figma, obviously it's going to be largely digital. And it allows you to sort of explore how your users might actually interact with your app or your design or whatever screens you have, and how your interfaces will behave as a result. So what will happen if my user clicks this button or presses on this sidebar or like drags this from one side of the screen to the other? Okay, let's remember fidelity. So um, fidelity is essentially the stage of completion, polishedness, and comprehensiveness of your designs. So low fidelity screen might just be the general layout, and the shapes, no color, nothing, just very bare bones. Mid fidelity leads to a point where you might color or specify things that your users might interact with. Like you might notice that the follow button on this Instagram um, web screen is highlighted, and so is this link. And then high fidelity is a state of near completion. So your prototyping is put in place, users can interact with the screen and see how the interface reacts as a result. Essentially, prototyping is a way for you to form connections between two objects and leads you from point A to point B. So whether that's screen A to screen B, or this object is moving across the screen, you'll get from one point to another through prototyping and having your users interact with the prototype. So let's take a look at this Instagram example. This is a cat of a former Figma Decal TA. And if we look at the Instagram, if we look at the screens or the frames portrayed above, you can see how we get from point A to point B to point C through interactions, right? Like all pretty intuitive to us. We're looking at the cat's profile page, and then we want to take a closer look at the first photo. So we click on it and it brings us to this page. So point A to point B. And then we want to comment on the post. So we interact with this little comment bubble, click on it, and it brings us to this third page, point B to point C. So pretty self-explanatory, probably something we interact with in our daily lives. But all of that is done through prototyping. So essentially, if you think of the frames that you want to prototype actions between as points like A, B, and C, you can create multiple instances of, you can prototype multiple interactions that extend off of a point A. And also, you can have multiple types of objects that lead back to a point. So you can see that I can prototype different actions for point A to lead to point B and for point A to lead to point C. And then also, both point A and D lead back to point B through some user interaction. So going back to this cat page, if we look at Instagram's saved or collections feature, we can see what we saw with this, where you can take multiple interactions and go from point A either to point B or point C. So looking at the saved button, if I just press it, this tiny overlay that says save to collection will pop up. So that's point A to point B. But if I press and hold, this menu where it automatically creates a new collection for you to name pops up. So that's point C. So you can see how different user interactions will lead to different results. Now, how do you actually navigate prototyping in Figma? Let's talk about that a little bit. So to enter what we call prototyping mode on Figma, you can just go to the prototype tab on the right sidebar. So if I go to my Figma file, over here is that right tab, and we're usually in the design tab. That's what we've been in so far. But if I go to prototype, I can start prototyping. And a shortcut that I like to use is Shift E. You can use Shift E to switch between prototyping and design. So I just use that a lot. Okay, and then also a cool thing about Figma and prototyping is that you can sort of view your prototype on a bunch of different types of devices. So you can sort of preview it on any sort of tablet or computer or smartphone or nothing at all. Our slides are not on any sort of like preset device. But if they were, we could prototype them and we could view them like this or like this on, yeah, an iPhone and a Surface Pro. So you can sort of preview how it would appear like on mobile or something like that, which can be really useful. Okay, and then to actually get into building these interactions, to add a prototype interaction, let's say I want to change this red square into this big red square into the smaller one. I'm going to build a connection, and how I'm going to do that, you'll see, is by selecting the square, clicking this plus sign, and dragging it to the next frame. And so you'll be able to edit that interactions details to get what it, to make sure it do what you want it to do. So that when you click on the red square or the big square, it'll change into the small one. There are a couple different aspects or components of a prototyping interaction that are a bit confusing to understand. So let me break them down. There's a trigger, an action, and an animation. So if you think about the example with the cat. So let's say like I want to view this post closer, right? What am I gonna do to make that post bigger to me? I'm gonna click on it, and that's a trigger. On click is what it's called in Figma. And what's gonna happen as a result? I'm gonna go to this whole frame, and that is what we call an action. So going back over to this terminology, you can see that there are a couple of examples on these drop downs of like what different triggers and actions and animations are. So yeah, triggers essentially are gonna be like, okay, well, what are we gonna like respond to in terms of what the user does? If the user hovers, if the user clicks on this object that we built a connection from, if the user like presses a certain key, something will happen. Actions is what actually happens. Am I going to go to this new screen? Is this small overlay going to open? What is going to happen? And then animation is, how is that change going to happen? Is it going to happen instantly just like that? Or is object A going to dissolve into object B? Is one screen going to push another screen out? You have a ton of options. So yeah, so essentially triggers are a user interaction, the user's choice. actions are what happens, and animations are how those actions happen. I know that's a little bit confusing, but does anyone have any questions about like these components of prototyping? We'll do lots of examples too, so that you get a better sense. Okay, awesome. So once you've clicked on that blue plus sign and built a connection between two frames, you can edit all the interaction details in that panel that pops up. You can edit everything about the trigger, the action, and the animation. So if you look here, they're all labeled, and you can basically decide like what kind of interaction you want to have. So here's a good example of something that's like prototyped and what a simple connection looks like. So they're building a connection from this red square to the orange one. And what they're doing is they say probably like on click, I want this to change into this. And they also want to make sure that the orange square changes back into the red one. So it's sort of like a equal and opposite reaction type deal where not only can you click on the red square to change it into the orange one, but you can click on the orange one to change back into the red one. And so that's sort of something to account for a lot when you're prototyping. You want to be able to make something happen, but also to cancel something out. Cool. Any questions on what's happened so far? All right. Let's talk more about prototyping functions then. Okay, so what can I do with prototyping tools? You can do a lot actually. So, I think the most obvious answer is to be able to like sort of simulate what an app might look like, and how an app might behave if you have someone interacting with it. But you can also make animations. You can, yeah, make, I guess you can like make illustrations. You can sort of just like make things move when you feel like it. So we will talk about some basic ways to implement prototyping. And I think that week 8 will be really fun because it gets into like more advanced prototyping. But yeah, you can see like on the side here, you have someone who's like simulating this Explorer app and they're using the prototyping tool to like allow the user to swipe between screens, or you know, they are using a prototyping connection to show how this like orange circle moves across the screen back and forth, with one like prototyping interaction. And you can see how like web-like and complicated it can get. But let's get into that. So I think that a really relatable prototyping example outside of the Instagram one is a Spotify interface. So here, these screens show how you can use prototyping to navigate between screens. And essentially, let's pretend that you've looked up Leanne La Havas in Spotify and you want to go to like this playlist that Spotify has created. Well, what are you gonna do? Pretty intuitive. You're gonna click on that playlist cover and it'll bring you to that screen. So you'll see that the interaction details show on click. When you click on this square, it's gonna navigate to this screen, and this is the way it's gonna do it. The screen is gonna slide in from right to left. So you see this happens here. Click this square and this screen slides in. And they've also prototyped a reverse action where if you click this back arrow, this screen is going to slide in. So yeah, pretty simple, just a screen sliding in and out, but pretty cool to do through prototyping. Some other prototyping examples exist with components. So you might have like a checkbox component, or if you click on the box, a check mark will appear. You might have a different one with toggles. So every time you click on the toggle, it might turn green. You click on it again, and it goes back to like the deactivated gray state. Or you can swipe blocks away by, deleting emails, and each email might be like its own component card that you can get rid of. So hopefully these make sense. Give me a thumbs up, middle, down if the examples we just covered make sense. Okay, sweet. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about actions and animations. So what happens when the user actually does something? I think triggers are pretty like straightforward, but actions and animations can be a bit more confusing, and you'll have a lab this week that covers both of them. But yeah, just remember that there are a bunch of different types of actions, and they're basically what happens as the result of a trigger taking place. And then animations is the how of how that action happens. So essentially, let's just go over a bunch of different actions. One is open overlay. So you'll see if you look at the prototyping on the left, that this frame is connected to this tiny rectangle up here. And what's happening in this GIF is not that like this frame is changing into the tiny rectangle, but the tiny rectangle is like coming onto the frame. So what I like to think of when I use overlays is like, oh, when you like get a text, usually it shows up as a banner on top of your screen, right? And it just like shows up at the top of your screen, like drops down, but the rest of your screen doesn't disappear. It's simply just like another layer being like sliding down. So that's what overlay does. Navigate to is probably the most popular like action used with prototyping. Essentially, again, it's like the very classic, like how do I get from point A to point B? So yeah, it's just very useful, and like you can customize a lot of things to get from one point to another between different frames and objects. So point A, big square, point B, small square. And then there are a bunch of animations that we can use to describe how we can get from point A to point B, or how something will happen. So dissolve is like a pretty distinct one. You'll just see like that the animation, like, I don't know, like one thing dissolves into another. In another case, in other cases, a lot of it is like being pushed or moved or slid in and out. And you can just sort of experiment when you're actually prototyping to see like how that looks to you. Because it just takes a lot of experimenting to see if something looks natural to you. But yeah, you can also like edit the animations through the type of easing curves that you use. And yeah, there's just like a lot of customization that happens with animation and actions. Again, best explored just by doing. Cool. Okay, so let me go through a couple notes on prototypes. The first thing is that while prototyping is like an extremely cool thing in Figma that you can do without code, and it has like extensive capabilities, it can get kind of complicated because as you can see here, like there's just like a lot happening. So what's happening in this screen? Well, Myles has a bunch of daily tasks written in a list. And essentially the idea is like if you click on one of them, then it'll like cross it out on the list. And then you have like a bunch of options. So basically you have like a bunch of permutations about like what can happen and what can lead to which screen based on the order that you like check off these items on the list. And that takes a lot of prototyping. This is like a very simple like interface to interact with, right? You're literally just checking things off. But he had to prototype like so many different things to make sure that like yeah, to make sure that he accounted for the different orders that things can be checked off in. So prototyping can get very complicated, and it definitely, yeah, has its limitations. Another note to make about prototyping is that often you're using like a lot of the screens that are like the same or slightly different from each other, but they'll be built off of like duplicated frames, so they might all have the same name. And that can get really confusing when you're prototyping. So one thing is to create like a layer naming system, which is what we do for our slides. So for example, this corresponds to the slides for this week, and DA corresponds to design accessibility and what number within that section it is. So if I take you over to our slides, looking at the design accessibility slides, we have them like named DA/5, 6, etc., just so that we are not confused when we prototype between slides. Another thing that you can use in prototyping is components. And it's sort of just good, clean practice to keep your components in one place where you can utilize them in your prototype. Yeah, so with prototyping in Figma, you can create what we call different user flows to preview how a user might interact with something. And basically what that means is you can create like a bunch of different paths, like think back to Spotify. One user flow might be to just simply like open the app and click on a playlist on the home screen and press play. But someone else might not do that. They might open up the app, click on the search bar, search something up, click on a playlist, and then press play. So you can sort of like preview these different paths that users might take through prototyping. And that's really important and useful for something when you're doing like user testing, also called A/B testing, when you want people to decide like between maybe two options, which one they respond to better. So when you're prototyping in Figma, when you create a new connection between two frames, it'll automatically create what we call a flow starting point. And what that looks like is essentially just okay. What that is something like this. This is a flow starting point. And you can subtract it or add it, and you can rename it. And a flow starting point is essentially just like, oh, like this specific user flow starts there. It's a good way to track like where, someone's user journey might start. And there are a bunch of ways to add a flow starting point, but I just like to do that through this panel. And flows are just generally pretty useful because you can sort of block off different parts of your prototype so that you know exactly like what process or like, yeah, what flow you're testing in a specific moment. It's just very organizational, very purposeful. Yeah, and again, like I mentioned, you can name flows different things and also give them descriptions. Again, which is just very useful so that you know what they're for, you have proper documentation. And yeah, you can just keep track of things much more easily. Okay. That was the bulk of the explaining prototypes. So I know that we went over components of a prototyping interaction, flows, sort of some examples. Are there any questions that I can answer or anything that was confusing about lecture so far? Okay, sweet. Yeah, and again, I do think that this week's lab will be an awesome way to practice actually building connections and practicing with prototyping. But let's jump into a demo. And we're actually kind of not falling behind on time. So I might ask you guys to engage if you're willing to engage with me. Otherwise, you can just watch me explain everything. But we're gonna do a quick demo. Okay, so you might also have this up if you have the slides pulled up and you have your own copy. But let's practice prototyping with a mobile interface. As we know, that's like a pretty common use of prototyping. So some goals that we have for this demo is to add an overlay sidebar, navigate to a new page, and prototype a button click on this forest study timer app. So I've pulled this up and I have 3 tasks. So open overlay, navigate to what looks like the settings page, and then use this like prototype this like button toggle. So I'm gonna try to start with opening the overlay. Does anyone have an idea for how I might do that? Seems like I want to be able to press this and have a sidebar open. Yeah, that can be one part of it. But how would I get there? So I can define this as my point A, right? Like I want to be able to interact with this little bar thing. And what would I draw point B to? Yeah, exactly. So I want to do that. Um, and now I can edit my interaction details. So on click, I think that looks fine. I want to be able to just click this. Um, and what kind of action do I want? Do I want to keep it as navigate to, or is it something different that might apply? Yeah, nice. So I just want this to pop up in front of the screen, um, or like on top of the existing screen. And you'll notice that Figma also has these cool things, these cool settings where you can just close the overlay when you click like outside of it, and also like change the opacity of the background behind it. Okay, awesome. I think that covers it for one. The next thing we want to do is to be able to navigate to the settings page. So let's say you have your overlay open. Um, how would I navigate to the settings page? What would I want to do as a user? Yeah, click on settings. So I want to draw a connection here, and then where would I lead that connection to? Yeah, awesome. Um, and remember what I said about like the reaction? What would I do to close the settings page to bring me back to the home page? Yeah. And so lead from the X back to here. Okay, cool. Um, and you can see here, I just renamed it and I can write description of what this flow is for. Okay, sweet. One more task. Um, we want to be able to change the toggles, right? So how would I change, or how would I prototype to make sure that I can change the toggles? Yeah, exactly. And then I will probably want to do something in reverse. Oops. Perfect. Okay. One thing that we didn't necessarily talk about was the animation of all of these. So why don't we just see how this prototype works? And you guys can tell me if you think that like the animation, aka like the how of like how these changes happen, seem natural or like how an actual like app screen would function to you. Um, okay, so first I want to be able to open the sidebar. We'll click that. Looks good. Click settings. Cool. Count exceeded time. Close the settings. Okay, what do people think? Did they like the animations? Did they think it looked natural? Is that like how an actual app would function? Yeah, yeah, awesome. So yeah, feel free to try that demo on your own. and play around and like just play around with the types of animations and actions that happen. And you can see how things like might look more intuitive or not. But yeah, that was just a quick prototyping demo. And now you know like how it might be used for both screens and button and component type things. Okay, so thanks for doing that little demo with me, and thanks to everyone who volunteered. I know it can be excruciating, but I really appreciate it. And that is pretty much all we have for today's lecture. Yeah, so let me just go through a couple announcements, but before I do, any other questions or any other points of confusion I can answer about prototyping? All right, cool. So, yeah, a couple of wrap-up announcements. So for the next 2 weeks, you are not going to have any homework. We just want you to focus on the midterm project, have fun with it, be really comprehensive with it. We know that a lot of you have other midterms for classes, and so we don't want like this decal by any means to be the most stressful class you have. But this is a really cool project that you have full agency over. So, yeah, feel free to like put as much into it as you'd like. And personally, we love looking at all the midterm projects because they're just like so personal. And yeah, people get really creative with it. So yeah, make sure to get in your proposals for your project if you didn't like any of the original prompts into your TA by this Friday. And feel free to ask anyone for feedback or questions. Lab 5 this week, we'll be doing basic prototyping, and we'll sort of go through a mock-up of Spotify on web browser for that. Cool. And the secret word is forestry. Wait, is there a marker? Okay. Yeah, like the study of like forest, yeah, like not forest, like forestry. Oh no, I don't know if this is, I don't know if you can see this. Forestry. Okay, anyone need that like spelled again or repeated? Okay, sweet. So the secret word is forestry. You have 2 weeks to work on the midterm, no homework. Really fun Spotify prototyping lab this week. And also accessibility is important. Those are my main takeaways for you. Yeah. Okay, sweet. And if you ever have any questions, you should go talk to Ace in office hours. That's pretty much it. All right. Thanks, everyone.